It's precisely at times such as this that we must keep open channels for communication that are frank but also respectful, that are based on a recognition of the seriousness of the issues that we face, and are conducted in a calm and analytical fashion. And by way of introduction, I'd also just like to caveat my remarks by making it clear that I am from a non-governmental research institute, which has lasted for just over 180 years, and has throughout that period been responsible for seeking to promote calm understanding of the very serious issues with which this conference is engaged. The UK, like Russia, is a proud country, proud of its history and determined to defend its dignity. Like Russia, we are a neutral weapon state and a permanent member of the UN Security Council. We are both major powers, and it's inconceivable, I think, to think of the possibility of creating a stable European order, or indeed even a stable world order, without powers such as Russia and the UK being involved. I think a number of speakers this morning from the Russian government were right to identify a trend towards multipolarity in the world, especially as a result of the rising economic and indeed military strength of major Asian countries and other developing countries. And they were right also to make clear that the trend towards multipolarity also means that we need to strengthen the multilateral order centered on the United Nations and genuine respect for international law. I think I would add only one point to that general thesis, which is that it needs to be an inclusive multipolarity. It needs to include the major powers of Asia, Brazil, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Indonesia, and so on. It is also the case that many of the major powers of today's world are proud and voluntary treaty allies of the United States. In NATO, a large majority of European states are voluntarily members of NATO and have been in most cases for many years. In Asia, countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, all proud states, are also voluntary allies of the United States. And it's quite wrong to see any of those countries as being satellites. Each of those states, including my own, is an independent actor, looks out for its own interests, takes part in security cooperation on a voluntary basis when it chooses to do so. And I think Russia and the UK themselves have very important historic experience of alliance. After all, our two nations, at that time, the British Empire and the Soviet Union, have a special history of shared struggle in perhaps the greatest trauma of recent European history, the war against Nazi Germany. And the British people, I can tell you, were, and indeed still are, aware of the massive sacrifices, bigger than any other ally, that were made by the Soviet people to achieve victory in that struggle. And from that wartime alliance between the UK, the Soviet Union, and indeed the US and many others, we all drew the lesson that we must never again see a major war in Europe. We together helped to create the United Nations. We agreed that never again would any state annex the territory of another state. On the UN Security Council, even at the worst times, we kept open channels to discuss with each other the hot spots of the day, even when we disagreed fiercely on how those issues would be resolved. And with the end of the Cold War, we made much more progress in creating a Europe that was united and free. The Iron Curtain that had divided Germany for decades was at an end. We opened up societies to each other. People moved between Western and Eastern Europe much more freely. Even one of the leading football clubs in my capital is owned by a Russian businessman. That's an indication of the openness our country was prepared to show to Russia with the end of the Cold War. And for much of the period, both in former Soviet republics and in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, we were able to carry through significant reductions in our defence budgets because neither side believed that major war was again a possibility. Unfortunately, as we all know, over the last 4 years, those positive trends have begun to reverse in very worrying ways. Since the Ukraine crisis began just over 4 years ago, the breadth and frequency of contestation between Russia and NATO, between Russia and the US, between Russia and the UK has increased. Today, what began as a focus on the particular problems in relation to Crimea and Eastern Ukraine has broadened into a series of difficult, even intractable issues. Geopolitical contestation has spread from Europe to the Middle East and taken on new forms, often characterized by deniability and accompanied by intensive propaganda wars. And there's growing military tension between Russia and NATO as we each deploy more capable forces closer to each other than had been the case for much of the period since 1990. And as part of that process, after a long period until 2015, in which most European countries in NATO were cutting their defence budgets, even though Russia was increasing its. Since 2015, since the events in Ukraine, most European NATO countries, including my own, are reluctantly increasing their defence budgets. We've also seen, I think, very worryingly, in part because the norms, international norms, are so unclear, we've seen a growth of cyber aggression in order to achieve economic advantage, strategic advantage, and indeed disrupt the democratic political processes of major countries, including the United States. And the cumulative effect of that erosion of trust between European states and Russia is that the lubricant that allows us to live in peace with each other is leaking. The lubricant of trust is ebbing away step by step with each new crisis. The very ambiguity of current forms of contestation means that no one quite knows where the red lines are. And as Foreign Minister Lavrov, I think, made clear yesterday in his remarks, the consequences of that erosion could well be dangerous. When a highly toxic banned nerve agent is used in a peaceful English country town, that feels like a new breach of international norms. When in Syria, one of the most devastating conflicts we've seen for decades, even in the Middle East, when that war involves the use of chemical weapons on multiple occasions, that feels like another retrograde step, another erosion of one of the pillars of international security. So we do live in a very worrying world. But how can we work together to stop the downward spiral in which we currently seem to be engaged? First of all, I would draw your attention to the major speech which President Putin made during the election campaign. Much of the focus on that speech was in the many new and imaginative strategic missiles which Russia was going to be buying over the next decade. But I draw your attention also to the first half of President Putin's speech, in which he made many specific promises to address the Russian people's needs for more spending on health, on education, on countering poverty, on building more housings. And that first half of President Putin's election speech read to me remarkably similar to the sort of election speeches you get from Prime Minister Theresa May or many other European countries. Our Prime Minister, also under intense pressure to address the crisis in our health service, to create houses for our young people, and so on. Security is always going to be the first priority of any government, but mutual security is much cheaper, as well as being much more secure. Second, I think we do need to find ways to stop digging ourselves deeper into mutual confrontation. When our leaders are considering the next step, interfering in another election, launching another cyber aggression, or whatever it might be, they do need to ask whether that tactical gain from such activity is really worth the erosion of trust involved. And thirdly, I think we need to remember that we have many overlapping, not identical, but overlapping interests geopolitically. Western powers, including my own, I think are rather more concerned with Iran's regional activities than Russia is. But the UK, France, Germany, and Russia all share a strong commitment to keeping the Iran nuclear deal going, and will continue with that commitment even if the United States adopts a different policy. We deeply disagree on Crimea and Ukraine, but I at least think there is some mileage in recent proposals that the United Nations could work alongside OSCE to develop, with the agreement of all parties, a significant role in supporting the full implementation of the Minsk Accord, if possible by deploying UN peacekeeping forces on the ground in the Ukraine. Certainly ending that conflict would be a major step to easing the tensions that currently afflict our continent. We also don't agree on Syria, but I do hope that our Russian friends here recognize that NATO states, including the United Kingdom, have played a key role in the defeat of Islamic State in Iraq and in eastern Syria. And I hope that the Syrian government will learn lessons from the Iraq experience. Iraq, a country which has faced many traumas since 1991 and especially since 2003. But is beginning, I think, to rebuild an inclusive political process that involves all major confessional groups, and indeed is increasingly bringing in key neighbours such as Saudi Arabia as well as Iran. And fourth, in the military sphere, I believe we do have a common interest in preserving the treaties created at the end of the Cold War and subsequently. That we are all better off for maintaining the INF Treaty and the New START Treaty. And in relation to conventional forces, there's much we need to do and we should be doing to strengthen dialogues between our militaries, to increase transparency of our conventional forces. As other speakers have mentioned, the UK now has 800 military personnel in Estonia, working alongside our French allies, providing necessary assurance to our good NATO ally. That force is too small to pose any offensive threat to Russia. But I think the UK would be more than willing to enter into enhanced transparency and confidence building measures on a reciprocal basis if there is any doubt in that regard. There's also much I think we could do in terms of confidence building in relation to air forces. We already have a bilateral agreement with Russia on preventing naval incidents. I think we can think now that our forces are operating in closer proximity with each other, having more confidence building measures in relation to air forces. Many other possibilities could be explored by the relevant experts of both our countries. So, in conclusion, as security professionals here, we share a deep responsibility to consider all these questions in a sober and professional manner, without rhetoric or an over-emotional approach. That will not be easy, and it will become progressively harder the more crises emerge. But if Russia is willing, I am confident that the UK and indeed other NATO allies will also be prepared to rise to the challenge of restoring mutual security in Europe. Thank you.